is the Wizard and Oz podcast, a future-focused show looking at current events and what we can do about them. I'm joined by the Wizard Tristan Barker, an infamous internet troll turned investment banker, reformed fugitive, and Indigenous environmentalist. Alongside him, Oz Sultan, a Republican district leader in Harlem and metaverse pioneer. He's focused on clean tech and blockchain legislation. An American Muslim, he's also heavily interested in bridging the gap between faiths. My name is Lachlan. I'm your moderator and a halal snack pack enthusiast. Today, we want to talk about the evolution of social media. I've got a few questions for both of you around sort of the pre-social media days as these technologies were emerging and then the impact that has had now on society. So starting there, I'd like to ask Oz, what's your impression of how things have changed, given that you would have had experience pre-Meta, pre-Twitter, all the large social medias?
Yeah, I mean, I think I first got into social in it's like 2000 or 2001 with Zanga, and I mean that was back when it was the chat wars. You know, it was AOL versus MSN versus ICQ versus all this other stuff. And I was actually working for FYE at the time, which used to be the largest music store in America. And it owned, about 15 other brands, about 3,000 stores. I mean, they acquired Tower Music in a debt deal at the end. But, also a company that I watched my CEO tell Steve Jobs basically in a meeting to go fuck himself over calling the iTunes store the FYE store because our CEO couldn't figure out how to make money just selling singles. As opposed to selling albums. And it tells you that, the jumps in technology we go through. I remember when I'd gotten, my first, Facebook, and I mean, I'll just go through the things. There was a point in time where, there were specific cadres of people who were willing to sleep with you for a Gmail invite, okay? And then we went through the MySpace period. And that gave way to, the first time I had access to Facebook, and getting on Facebook. And this was, I graduated a couple of years earlier, and the proliferation of that and, early Twitter. What's interesting between now and then is it was MySpace went down, Facebook came up, and then Twitter came up. And then we had this host of dozens of other companies that popped up that were successful, that failed. You had the Foursquares of the world. You had the rise of Instagram, the acquisition by Facebook. You had Snapchat. You had Musical.ly, which, then was acquired by the Chinese and became TikTok, right? People forget that one. And it was an interesting time. I mean, it was crazy conferences. I was pretty involved. I used to run the fourth largest tech meetup in the United States in New York called the Web2O meetups. And I mean, I was speaking at conferences with MC Hammer. It was just like the strangest time ever. And it's just like I'd be sitting there with MC Hammer and a bunch of people after 140 Conf, And there's a lot of people that have become very successful now as social media influencers where, that was kind of like their launch period. It was also the same time where I had a ton of friends who were very significant YouTubers, and I think Swift Karate Chop isn't really one anymore. Dave Days is sort of there. The early guys aren't really there anymore. And if you even think about that, we went through a cycle in the teens where most of those people aren't there anymore. The Vine people aren't there anymore, that kind of a thing. So that's where we've come from. What we're going through right now is really interesting because it sort of echoes that, right? And it echoes that in the sense that inside of a couple of weeks, Blue Sky was out there and people were signing up for it. And it's kind of a Twitter clone, but more like Mastodon. Mastodon was there, and that's a distributed Twitter clone for those of you that don't know that. But with Twitter doing their rate limit about 2 weeks ago to prevent scraping, all of a sudden what happened was they opened the door for like, all right, well, maybe we should go and do something else because people were being throttled. That, if you didn't have a verified account, it was 800, 600, then 800, then 1,000 tweets, and it was resolved within a couple of days. But so all of a sudden, Parallels launches. Parallels gets to 100 million users in like 7 days, and within an additional 7 days, their engagement's down 50%. And I think part of this too is overload. Like, you have brands that have specifically decided not to go onto onto threads. You have people that are now just deciding to kind of retrench onto specific platforms because that's where their audiences are. And that was kind of what had happened previously with the messenger wars that led to MySpace, that led to Facebook. But now what we have is the distributed and not so distributed sort of microblogging wars in between Twitter and Threads and Blue Sky and Mastodon and a variety of things out there. But you also have people looking for something different, right? And I'm working with a company called Parallel Worlds in New York, and like we're pushing this whole social 2.5 like immersive social media concept because as the metaverse shapes up inside of the next call it 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and it really a lot of this comes to is the hardware prime time because it's not just yet. And I've got some mock-up glasses here I could show you later. It's just they're like the new augments that are coming out, in spring. And there's about 5 different sets of these coming out from different manufacturers. But until that's there's the need to kind of like step us into immersive social media, and I think that's where people want to go. It's kind of like where's your Club Penguin home once you get into social, so that you could kind of go and experience this metaversey stuff, even if it's augmented reality, but then still be in these feed structures and these chat structures that we're accustomed to inside of social. So I mean, that's my initial thought right now, is that we're moving towards that. It is the breakup all over again. It's also the transformation of some of these platforms. And the platforms themselves are going through the whole cycle that blogs had gone through. Blogs were incentivizing or were incentivized by a ton of sponsors and ad companies, to the point and degree that, like, I remember when blog CPMs could be like $80, $100, for like 1,000 ads. You come back to what's going on now. Twitter is sponsoring certain people to publish content, right? So we're getting into that again, and the nature of influencers is changing again. And so that's where I find us. I find us in this interesting state where all of this stuff is happening, and inside of all of this content, like debacle that we're going through, of like, what should you do, what platform should you use, we have the largest strike of television and film that we've had since it was led by Ronald Reagan 60 years ago. Okay.
Wow.
At that time, actor, not presidential or gubernatorial candidate Ronald Reagan, actor Ronald Reagan led those. That was 60 years ago. So think about this: when people have less to consume on television, they're probably going to opt to social media. But now you have a variety of additional microblogging platforms that are out there. You have a lot of different ways for them to to consume video content. And then you've got TikTok blocks that are out there. And then the last thing, I'll turn this over to Tristan because I'm being a little long-winded, is what's going on with Reddit. Like, Reddit inside of about 3 weeks has alienated about, I would say, 25 to 30% of their population. And they've made changes that make them look like an acquisition target more than like this is some radical business model change. And that's very curious.
Yeah, so yeah, really interesting and really good insight. Given that you've seen that entire evolution, I want to ask Tristan, given that you have direct experience as that social media mogul type of individual, sort of pre and during that sort of Vine era that that Tristan that Oz mentioned, and sort of running parallel, or kind of what you were doing sort of led into that chronologically.
Yeah.
What's your experience there in the change that's happened, and sort of how you worked with the algorithm to achieve the success that you did in your space?
A good comparison to make would be like Oz really understands the game from like the perspective of like someone that deals with like office and ownership of a sports league, whereas I was very much like confined to the court, so to
Yeah,
speak. So
totally.
I have tried to keep a little bit of awareness, but like I really didn't understand the business side until I'd say the first time I realized that looking into the business side could actually help me. I was a couple years in. I'd already had a couple of world records for engagement, and I was starting to try and understand like how do these rule shifts happen that change what's an ideal strategy, right? Like when Oz was saying, like you used to have a CPM of $80 to $100. That's cost per mileage. That's how much does 1,000 views cost to get? Like, what's the value of that attention economy? And when I entered at the start, there was an extremely high trust environment for information that came through a screen. That was a hangover from the value of attention from the TV era. My dad, being a musician, he explained sort of these concepts to me a lot, and he talked about like, well, internet service providers are selling the pipeline of information and content to move now. And he was sort of explaining like the money's drying up in music. And so me being a musician and a comedian, I sort of saw things were moving more in the favor of comedy over music in terms of that expansion. Comedians can sell a book better than a musician can. Books are one of the only things that's actually retained that value of content creation. And then in particular, I got honed in on memes and short form content. And so it was about 2012, 2013 that I first started actually even paying attention to more than just like what content am I making, who's that resonating with, what do those numbers reflect, and does this pay me enough YouTube ad revenue to stay drunk? Like it was quite a narrow section of the fishbowl that I was paying attention to before I started really thinking like, hey, what time of day are they feeding us? Who's feeding us? You know, that kind of thing. And so the first time I really looked beyond my enclosure as an entertainer was in 2013, seeing Mark Zuckerberg actually wanted Facebook to be more free than the creature it's become. And this doesn't surprise me. He studied group dynamics at Harvard, and he very much understood the importance of allowing cultures to, you know, like he wanted to just provide a petri dish and let us fester as the nonsense we are as creatures. And he understood that that's actually more natural, and in the long game, it's probably more of a moral thing to do. But his shareholders, this is when I started to become a bit more business literate. His shareholders were like, no, you need to sell this ad space, right? Because he's got people, he's got their attention. People who are watching this and aren't aware of this, you are the product, right? Like Facebook's not actually sold to you, the user. You're sold to the advertiser. You're the product. And Zuck, I'll say he was wise on this. He was absolutely correct. He wanted to maintain the organic content and the sort of realness of his platform, because he knew that that's actually what kept the CPM high, because people were engaged. They were there for a real reason. They were there seeing the stuff that remember, you used to follow something and you got all the posts from that person. It was that simple. There was no, this is what you should see today. There was no, let's show you the 5 things before we give you the ad, because this is how we think we're going to trick you into buying McDonald's tonight.
Right.
Like there was none of that yet. There was just, you're on this platform and you're highly engaged in this platform because you've been allowed to have your organic group dynamics form within a place that can host content and allow people to express themselves and cluster together and group together naturally. But the shareholders said, yeah, but how's that make me money? And instead, they're thinking quarterly. They weren't thinking in a longer term of let's maintain this organic platform. Our biggest advantage is that we're not TV. And instead, they started thinking, how can we ram more ads down people's throats each month, each quarter? And they said, because we own this, you have a financial obligation, Zuck, to listen to our interests, or you can get sued. So
Right.
What I want to know with that is that, with that being the organic and more sort of natural course for that, for the platform, being interfered with and disturbed by the need to generate ad revenue, is that something that because what you're describing there, where people would sort of curate their own timelines and build these communities with other people, I think that there's probably a huge propensity within that to effectively create vast echo chambers within that are just filled with people.
Yeah, let me explain the horrors of how that developed over basically the next 3 years.
Yeah, great.
After 2012, 2013, Facebook had to give up its beloved tagline. Its old tagline used to be, "It's free and it always will be."
Mm-hmm.
They had to give that up because people no longer really independently owned their broadcast potential. What they did next was they introduced the dynamic algorithm, as opposed to static, being you follow this thing, you'll get its posts chronologically. Now it's dynamic. We decide what you want to see, right? So first of all, they've completely distorted the flow of information and the sort of like high trust allowance of reach into individual people, and decided, no, we own this, and we can tax your influence more or less, and control it and decide what is and isn't allowed. So that was just, I can't even explain. Like it went from being, if it was 100, it went to being negative 500 in terms of being a tool that actually supports genuine human connection. And then not only did they completely go from, organic turkey to Taco Bell meat, they then made the drive through a conveyor belt by introducing time into their algorithm, right? So in 2012, before all of this, I took Lil Wayne's world record for engagement on a text post, which was like him a couple sentences saying, "I want this world record. Everyone, get on this post," basically. I gave like a page-long satirical sort of, edgy 17-year-old's take, roasting Nicki Minaj and talking about how she was like, I saw her, and I still see her as a turning point from there sort of being a subtle sexualization of pop stars to let's take a woman who's gotten famous. I actually thought it was fine that she had a rap career talking about her being who she was. I was not a fan of her having like that song Starships, where she's like putting like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star into a song, pushing like a sort of a really hypersexualized, like a culture that's come from street sex work and really unsafe environment and value system. They were sort of meshing that with the almost like the Disney pipeline, getting her to work with Ariana Grande. All of this, I'm like, you're basically touching kids with extra steps here. And when I made that comparison, evidently people were feeling what I said, right? And I used to have an amazing ability to usher in what people's subconscious was really thinking and what the suggested media was not providing them, right? I was offering supply to a demand that already existed and was implied by the negative dialectic of the false information being shoved down their throats. It was an extremely effective formula for organic content. I was outperforming Sony as an individual kid with a laptop, right? That's how organic things used to be. Then
But
not
let me
only
let
did
me
it
add,
become
let
a
me add to
suggested
that.
post thing.
What
Go on.
Tristan did hijacked the algorithms because he started in the early algorithm era and then worked through the complicated algorithm era, as opposed to now where I call it more segregation, because the algorithm basically restricts
Yes,
your reach artificially,
that is
and segregates it into specific communities, and more often than not keeps you in echo chambers. I mean, Twitter's kind of done a little bit the opposite, where it's sticking opposite views to what you want in your face. But your everything that you did and everything that you walked through allowed you to literally conduct kind of like narrative warfare on a scale that hadn't really been thought about before.
yeah, and it came from like I had 20,000 followers max because I used to roast local bullies. Like I'd find
Mhm.
who's the guy with 5,000 Facebook friends who's a real dick in his
Mhm.
area, in his school area when I was in my teens, and I would roast the crap out of them. And I started to aggregate a following throughout Melbourne and throughout Australia eventually, by just sort of roasting people that people wanted to see taken down a notch. So I was doing something that was very natural from a sociological perspective, and that I had an idea one day. Hang on, what if I do this, but with the global bullies? Like the people who are controlling this narrative, bullying people into, hey, young girls, if you don't pay for this, that, and the other thing, then you're not really attractive. Like these are all subtle forms of bullying.
Mhm.
And I was like, how do I undo these artificial forms of cultural control? And as soon, like, I literally had that thought, and I'm like, who should I go for? Oh, I'll go for Nicki Minaj. First thing that I applied this approach to,
Mhm.
world record. And in that era, that was when like Humans of New York was really doing well. Like it was one of the
Yep.
biggest brands that
HONY.
it functioned off organic interest. And what I'd like to point out is that these are longer form content.
Mhm.
These are quite like long, like these are extremely long by today's standards of attention span. Your
Oh
bounce
God,
rate
yeah.
was within the first 3 seconds, even back then. Most people left content within the first 3 seconds. So if you gave something that managed to hook people in those first 3 seconds and be a satisfying couple of minutes on the internet, that was the best thing you could do. And that's what made people consume it, share it, represent their own thoughts and feelings through your content. And that's
Mhm.
what created virality back then. Not only did they create the dynamic algorithm, which was a shareholder thing, where they're like, yeah, let's push this into ads. In 2013, that's when you started seeing it getting really shortened because they added time into the algorithm. So the less time it took before a person interacted with the content refreshed, they were intentionally shortening people's attention span because that meant that they could sell more advertising space. And so
Mhm.
this, I'm sure Zuck would have hated because he knows that they were basically like they were inflating the value of views.
Yeah.
So I've a
They,
They
they,
had
question.
way
they've
more views they could give out each day,
they've
and
been
way less
inflating the value of
creative.
views for a long period of time, and I mean, one of the funniest things, no one really remembers this, but this was between 2018 and 2022. There were a bunch of lawsuits. There were a bunch of people that went to prison, and it was about $4 billion worth of basically like flawed ad inventory. It was just deployed on failed metrics, through a couple different companies. Heads of major agencies were taken down. Heads of ad serving networks were taken down. But the
Should be
average
able to
person
do
didn't
that
pay
to
any
Iggy
attention to this.
Azalea. They should be able
It's good.
to do that to Iggy Azalea.
Jesus. But I mean, I can see it happening again, because the thing is that for the amount of like the sheer volume of data that they collect on everybody for everything and everything they do, Facebook doesn't analyze a lot of this, right? And you also have to question the fact: do they store this data, or is this data purged, or worse than that, is this data sold, right? Like, remember when Amazon ramped up Alexa, then ramped down Alexa, then said they were selling Alexa? Then, then the question became like, what happened to all of these illegally recorded children's audio, right? What happened to all this
Ah,
illegally recorded house audio? Well, apparently half of that stuff's been sold, okay, and it was sold as like an asset because they weren't sure what they were doing with Alexa, and so now they've got some new super powered Alexa that they're going to stick an AI in, which makes it even more horrific in terms of a privacy concern in your house. Um, but those are kind of like the realities of what we have, and that's also where like the metaverse and a lot of these other things get scarier because when
yeah.
you have room scale vision on, I mean, they're not just tracking what's around you because there's a camera outward tracking your eyes and they're tracking your emotions, but they're tracking your pupils. So they really, on a
Mm.
level that they never had before, know what you're thinking and can influence you in ways that could be highly detrimental. I mean, it's bad enough now where they know that like you're triggerable and they'll just like feed you trigger content. You know, it's the same thing that I would say narrative attacks or narrative terrorism does, and the narrative manipulation that's out there is significant. And like a lot of the stuff that you've done, even with shit posting and stuff, like that's hysterical, but it proves a point. And then it also goes back to things like Cambridge Analytica. Like Cambridge is the tip of the iceberg of stuff that exists right now.
Mm.
There's fog data, there's 100 other companies out there. But I don't think what people are aware of is that, all of that terms and service that you sign allows for a lot of that data to be sold to third parties. And those third parties may not be anyone who's friendly to you, and sometimes not even friendly to our country.
I want to come back to this and expand a little bit on it, but just with a little bit more sort of foundational stuff, because something that I'm wondering from both of your perspectives is you have that 2013, 2014 era
Mm.
content. What was successful in virality then versus now? What is the main thing that's different now compared to then when we look at what is successful and
I
um
can,
and
I
viral
can
and
break it.
I'll say it first, but you can go. You used to have to be innovative, right?
Yeah.
Like it all was innovative content. It was innovative vines. It was all innovative, and now, I mean, you can do the same TikTok dance on a level, that someone really likes, and all of a sudden you're huge. You could do a simple video where, like, you're you're putting like Jello on the bottom of a plate and switching plates around and playing dumb, and then the other person slaps it on their face when you're doing something where you have to flip plates around. But these things are getting millions and millions of views. And then the
Mm.
weirder thing to me is the proliferation of the e-girl, right? So if you don't know what an e-girl is, it's like an anime looking girl that has an excessive amount of makeup on and does like little ooh, you know. Um, but there's now in TikTok engagement where you can give gifts and you can do all this other stuff. And so you literally have like, and I'm just waiting to see like when guys get on the bandwagon with this because it's all girls now. But like, they'll be they keep getting gifts. They're like, thank you, cake, oh, yum yum yum, yeah. And it's just it's like that stream of
Modifications.
consciousness
Yeah.
going on for
With,
hours and hours where people are just buying into this like simplistic idiom of like what a person is, and they're like, oh my god, so cute, da da da, because you have people with thirst feeding people with a financial thirst. But
yeah.
these TikTokers are making like 2 to 6 grand a month just doing those stupid videos. So the big difference is, one, it used to be innovative and it's now pedestrian. But two, the amount of money that you can make now from being a significant influencer is different than what it was back then. Because the only time that you're making major money was if you had millions of views on YouTube, right? Instagram, their payouts aren't that great. It's usually partnerships and like promotions. And I mean, the big joke that we have is like how many people are getting naked on Instagram selling weight gain powder or weight loss supplements, right? I mean, because that's like literally half of your feed. Unless you start engaging with like art, culture, religion, that kind of a thing, and then it'll start changing your ranking, and it'll start changing the content that it's shipping to you. But there's that, and then the second thing I'll say is the corporatism of it. Like corporations used to do brand promotions, and they used to work with influencers in a way that was like kind of organic, and people would sample stuff and they do videos and testimonials. It's a little bit concocted now, and honestly, like it just feels really staid and forced more often than not. But Tristan, I mean, you could probably elaborate way more on this.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
Tristan, before you get started, I want to add on an extra question once you've explained your take on things. What would Facebook beef need to be today in order to do and achieve the same things that you did back in the day? Just as an extra add on to that initial question.
To get, I'd have to get myself Socrates to get away with 10% of what I used to be able to do. I would have to just straight up, accept that I'm not going to live after my next run, which is a debate I have with myself in the shower every day. I've got to fill myself with reasons to stick around in this world to prevent that.
If you were to speculate on what the content would look like, how would it be different now than it would have been then? This is hypothetical, by the way, not suggesting that this is actually real.
First of all, I would have to make myself a hero on 4chan, rather than anywhere that has a proper system of moderation or a segregated content approach. And I would have to do it on the run like I used to. I'd be staying with a different girl each night, posting from her stuff. I'd be disappointing 3 girls a night, telling them all that I'm going to stay at their place, so that anyone observing my sign-ins realizes that it's a waste of police resources to try and follow those written words. There's the operations of it are possible, but it would be so impressive that I'd probably end up with a job strictly doing ridiculous field work, or just executed. Like I would have to display capacity for danger that would make me look like this generation's Ned Kelly. It would be difficult. It's possible, absolutely possible. But when we went from that era where the shareholders started to pollute the news feed, what came next was the platform started to recognize the slip of trust. Breitbart was so disruptive in that space. I'd moved into having a viral media company at the time. I had a team of maybe 10 people. I was competing with the top viral media companies in the world because we had me as a writer. So we had less reach to begin with. We had less budget. But the thing is that when my content touched an outlet, it grew that outlet rather than depleting the outlet like other viral media things did. Oh, look, 10 things that you didn't know about, blah, 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 those types of things. Those were set up so that you get 10 views per person. That makes it all the way through. So you're multiplying the cost per mileage. You're getting more you're wringing more ads out of people. Facebook and other platforms that hosted this content didn't like that, because that you're harvesting more clicks from what they're sort of viewing as their flock of sheep. So they didn't like that. And in order to actually perform in that era, I had to look at what my Facebook newsfeed appeared to be brainwashing people towards and create content that was in line with that. So as a content creator, I became incredibly uninspired in that industry. I lost my passion for it. I sold that company off and started busking instead, because I legitimately enjoy that artistic connection with humans. I think that artists have a responsibility between humans who have real jobs to help them process their thoughts, feelings, and emotions. The same way that like mycelium networks process information for forest. I genuinely believe that humans who have artistic and sort of speaking capabilities, you guys probably understand this. You get stuck in thought of like, damn, people are behind. How can I help them process this? How can I help people get over this pain? Or how can I get over this hurdle of understanding? You know, like that's not a normal thing all humans have. The same way not all humans are fit for manual labor. The same way not all humans can give birth. You know, we're highly specialized creatures. And so I was really put off by that, but that left me in a place where I started really looking at the industry on an industry level. When I had a startup that should have succeeded, it got shut down because this reach started getting cut. And this was when you started hearing about the concept of fake news, right? And so this is where we went from organic timeline that got some of its views pimped out to shareholders. Platform's got to survive somehow, to the whole thing becoming a pimp fest occasionally with a piece of the content you actually asked for, to it becoming psyop with extra steps, was when they said, no, this is fake news, no, that's real information, no, this is disinformation. And we started to actually carve up the trust, right? Because we started with such a high trust environment, it came through the screen, it must be real in television, to a diversity of opinion in the organic era, turning more corporatized in the shareholder influence era, to then it becoming, FBI telling Facebook what they can and can't do and stuff like that. Like after the sort of the Cambridge era, after 2016 and Trump's election, the people that work on the highest spectrum of power decided this is what I reckon the platforms should do. And the platforms were all monolithic. People basically had monopolies on particular forms of content. You had Facebook, you had Instagram, you had YouTube. It was quite simple. There's a type of content and then there's a place where it all is. When the power started coming in, it started pushing into more of an oligarchy model, which is where we are now, where you've got Twitter on one hand and Threads on the other. And really, people are like, they're picking CNN and Fox now, right? But the problem is the people who are funding it on that level and who are using old school models of thinking don't realize that people are breaking further and further away from a two-faction system. They're developing a diversity of opinion, but they're just kind of realizing that it's not served. It doesn't exist properly on the internet anymore. So you've kind of got two centralized hordes, and then you've got people kind of having to pick a lesser of two evils. And the people who are viewing it as a lesser of two evils are becoming a larger and larger population, while the people who are trying to keep things in a more factionized system are becoming more and more desperate to do so. And so now they're actually breaking the trust of the screen itself by calling each other a liar, calling each other disinformation. And all they're doing is actually fueling that thing where now the consumers who are trying to be informed and they've got no trust, and most of them are just far from being educated enough to even form real individual opinion. Now they're getting sent back into like barbarism, right? People are watching more and more fight videos, just more fucking sex. And then there's also the other insidious effects known as Kris Jenner, which is where people started being given reality stars because they were more relatable, right? Like the Jersey Shore guys aren't real bodybuilders. They look more like you might if you still drink and eat the same way but take steroids. So they're starting to offer people this sort of vicarious fantasy that's closer and closer to mediocre. And this is why I think we're seeing so many musicians getting egged on stage now, because stages are a big deal. You're putting someone above you. You're all crowding around to watch them. And that used to be fine when you sat around and you watched, Joshua Bell, you watched Celine Dion, you watched people who are excellent at what they do, right? There was a real reason for that divide of power, because like you didn't make the sacrifices necessary to get 10,000 hours in on the violin. So you're going to go watch someone who did. right? But now when you've just got like the Disney pipeline deciding this person's a music star now, people are losing that respect.
Yep.
They're losing that craft respect. Russia, on the other hand, they don't give enough freedom of expression, but they have a massive amount of respect for craft. So like their equivalent of Justin Bieber, Vitas, is as good a singer as any singer in Russia is, right? And so he doesn't get to say much. A lot of his choruses don't even have words, but like, wow, beautiful voice. So on one hand, you've got an approach that you can see in some countries where the craft is being supported and the expression isn't. And then outside of the world, we're seeing too much of the expression being rewarded, regardless of its quality.
So
So
here's
that's why you see things like Antifa and people who have no literacy whatsoever about what they're forming a political opinion now, super extreme. It's
Right,
barbarism.
but let me add to that too. So, and I've published counterterrorism research on this. What's interesting and bizarre to me was, 10 years, 20 years ago, and maybe even longer than that, right? There were manuals when you joined a terrorist group, right? You joined the Klan. Here's your Klan book, here's your Klan paperwork, here's your hat. When you joined any kind of separatist, leftist army organization, because they were largely army organizations, it was like, here's a little red cookbook. When you joined an extreme right organization, here's the Turner Diaries, here's something to read. All of that changed over the course of social media. All of that changed because you had the rise of ISIS, you had the rise of some fragmented Christian groups in Central Africa, you had the rise of Buddhist terrorists in Myanmar, you had the rise of Antifa, and then beyond Antifa, you've had the rise of decentralized sort of like insurgent groups inside of different countries who sometimes are anti-government and who sometimes are Marxist, who sometimes are just anti-disestablishmentarianism, like they're about like wrecking shops and destroying things. They purport to be like part of a cause, but they're really just causing chaos and mayhem, but saying something completely different online in terms of the solidarity and who they're supporting, because in most cases they come in and wreck minority neighborhoods and they destroy the places that we go to. They're not going to their suburban neighborhoods, their lily white neighborhoods, and destroying that. They come and destroy our neighborhoods. And the challenge is that it used to be codified. It then became distributed and stuff online, like you could find pieces of it. But then it moved into online radicalization, right? And online radicalization was where these people were doing it through social media. They were contacting you, they're messaging you, they're saying like, you fit the criteria: lonely, looking for meaning, ostracized from friend groups in large S, not really connected to family or society, in some cases missing any kind of dogma or ideology. And those types of folks, and there's a plethora of them out there, used to just be recruited by, we used to say terrorist groups, right? Well, now they're being recruited by insurgent groups on the left, insurgent groups on the right, terrorist groups that don't necessarily have like a right or left political ideology, that it's something else, Islamist groups. And, the latest crazy part about all of this is private military. Right, because Wagner, which is fighting for Russia, maybe not for Russia, against Russia, almost invading Moscow, it's a big telenovela going on over there right now. But they're hiring and recruiting folks from places that you wouldn't think, and there's a mobilization of people into these systems of violence that you typically wouldn't see there. Wagner has hired Gurkhas from India. They've hired warlords from Central Africa. They've hired displaced child fighters. The kids where they were cutting, like, they were literally making an incision in the side of their head and shoving crack or they were shelving meth, or they were giving them black, which is cocaine and gunpowder, and then saying, "Here's a gun and go and just terrorize that village." And that you wonder why you ended up with gang rapes and mass violence and just people slaughtered everywhere because you made these kids crazy and you gave them guns and weapons and said, "Just do whatever you want." Right? So they're hiring those folks. And they're just kind of going around the world hiring, people who might have been working for private military before, offering them a little bit more, offering them some sort of like severance out to their family if they get killed, in the form of like an insurance annuity, and that's the state of affairs today. And this is before we've gotten into any large scale wars that might happen above and beyond the conflicts in Syria, the conflicts that are ongoing in the South China Seas, and the conflicts in Ukraine,
Do you
right?
think do you,
Uh,
do you think there's an aspect of social media today that is doing as you described? Like that just twigged for me as you were speaking about it. The idea that maybe there is an aspect of like making kids crazy and weaponizing them. Do you think?
Mhm.
there's a distinct. I personally think that because a lot of leaders look at us as citizens as really cattle management, and when you're able to fracture a society and fracture people, they're easier to manage. I think there is a large amount of that going on, and
Yeah.
I think it's coming from a variety of different places. I mean, as a religious person, I'll be the first person to say that, like, yeah, we've got some challenges inside of faith, with certain religious leaders, but on the largesse, I mean, it's a very small percentage of the population. But at the same point in time, you have to look at other things that are kind of coming into the foray here, especially when people are pushing social agendas or what they perceive to be, their moral agendas. And the word moral is kind of loose here because that changes a lot. And specifically when they start pushing agendas that really change the nature of adolescence, right? Because up until recently, we weren't really messing with education, um, of children, of anything that was really any controversial younger than puberty. But now we're doing that. And at the same point in time, we weren't talking about healthcare in the context of sexuality as we are now, and that is changing things. And you go through these cycles, and this is another interesting thing to talk about, like why this is happening. America is in the middle, and most of the world is in the middle of three cycles. Well, actually, four cycles right now. There's a 60-year cycle of political upheaval around social issues. Go back to the 1960s to see what we're dealing with today. There's a 100-year cycle of industrial revolution at the same time. So we're in the fourth industrial revolution right now. There's a 20-year cycle in terms of big tech boom. We are now into a tech boom that is just as big as it was, in the late 90s. And the last of this is that we are now in these compression cycles of economic boom bust. And so we are going into a bust, which we will be coming out of into a boom by 2025. So all of this stuff is happening at the same time. And inside of that, people are changing, the mechanism of communicating with people is changing, the medium by which they're communicating is changing, and the format is changing. Like, my buddy Robert Scoble says by 2026, Facebook is going to be 100% video content. There's going to be nothing written anymore. Now, Threads maybe throws a little bit of a wrench inside of that, but it's not the Facebook platform, it's not Instagram, and it's definitely not WhatsApp. So this is altogether plausible. And, that also goes into what I talk about with Web 2.5. It's like crafting economies are coming. All this stuff is economy. That's not really even prime time yet. But that's the crux of the challenge that you're faced with today, is
Mm.
that in part it's problems with systems, and that goes from secular to religious, but I think more people have issues with secular issues right now. There's a problem with the information that's being communicated and how it's being communicated. There's a problem with, really, I think it's just a change in the view of adolescence and removing that adolescence from happening in many cases.
Mhm.
And it's moving into another industrial revolution where we're seeing an erosion of child welfare laws. We're seeing an erosion of worker protections. We're seeing strikes on a massive level, and all of a sudden we're seeing people who, when we could probably get into this into another episode, who are worried about their jobs eroding to AI, and that's all happening at the same time inside of a changing conversational lexicon that is moving to short form video content where half the time they're not saying anything.
The
Yeah.
AI thing is big for me, because, and I sort of think this is surface level
We
stuff. Really.
cannot open that can of worms.
Oh.
I've got to wrap up and go. We should open that next episode.
Cool. Yeah.
We
no,
should.
Let's. There's a lot in that. Hey, I'm gonna write that one down.
Yeah. And let's. I just want to say before we go, because I know that we made a lot of points that are probably going to answer just as going to create as many questions as they answered. Please, anyone viewing, come into the Discord. We'd love to answer your questions more directly if we can.
Right.
And
Get in
start a
there.
discussion
One
as
last
well.
thing before you close, and I want to throw this out there, and I touched on this in the beginning. But can we talk about the Reddit debacle for a hot minute?
Yes, please.
I mean, can we just seriously just unpack this thing?
I've literally
there's
got a lawyer I've got to get onto, so I'll
no, I
watch
know. I'll wrap it up, and I'll do like quick 30 seconds. So their
Okay.
CEO comes in and says, "Hey, all you third-party apps," which by the way is like how a third of the audience gets, their 50, 60 million viewers get to the app. We're going to be charging you in a level right now that you have to pay much more for the APIs, and so Apollo and a bunch of the third-party apps were like, "Well, that's going to be over $1 million a month, so we don't make that, so we're just going to shut the apps down." So that's the first sort of like, door that fell. The second thing was interesting because the mods went to protest and they turned half of these major subreddits non-safe for work and started posting porn or pictures of John Oliver in protest. So again, their CEO came in and that part is great. And said, okay, we're going to defrock your mods, or we're going to remove you as controllers of these subreddits. So a lot of subreddits have shut down. Some of them, like Male Fashion Advice, which is a huge one, is moving to Discord. It's already on Discord, right? They're just off platforming. Then the third thing is they said we're getting rid of awards and we're getting rid of the entire system that you've used for like almost 15 years. Okay, the Reddit Gold system. So now people are giving all their awards that they've had away for free because these things aren't going to be worth anything. They're ignoring the fact that they have a huge market for snooze, which are the little Reddit avatars, in NFTs, and the fact that there's a crypto tied into this.
I'm
And
going
so
so I don't go to jail. Much love, guys.
All right. My personal purview is that they're teeing this thing up for a sale to Tencent because this whole shift of business, like business perspective idea that they're going to these new business models doesn't really make sense if you look at the fact that they're like cratering their value and they're cratering their audience.
Yeah, really interesting. And I think this is one that we should introduce at the start of the next episode and expand a bit further on, and lead that into some other discussions. So Tristan's.
I love that he's always got some jail issue to deal with.
Yeah,
I love this.
Always. So Tristan's had to leave us, so that's a really good time to finish up. Thanks for listening. Make sure you follow us on Twitter, YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, Instagram. We've got all the social medias up, Spotify as well. And see you in the next one. Thanks, Oz.
Bye, guys.
I'm not breaking the fourth wall. That's the thing.